He knew the moment the first reports came in that this night would be different. Louder, heavier, more politically charged than anything Ukraine had experienced in recent weeks. As explosions thundered across multiple Ukrainian regions, the world once again turned its attention toward a war that refuses to slow down, even as global leaders attempt to reshape its course. And here, on United War, he invites viewers to witness not just the events, but the forces behind them. Forces that stretch far beyond the battlefield and into the halls of international power. He begins with a hook that frames the moment clearly. Russia has intensified its strikes across Ukraine at the exact same time former U.S. President Donald Trump tries, and fails, to broker a path toward ending the war. It is a collision of diplomacy and destruction, of stalled negotiations and accelerating violence, and it paints a picture of a conflict that is nowhere near its conclusion. As he narrates, he describes how the night sky over eastern Ukraine turned a burning orange as cruise missiles streaked overhead and Ukrainian air defenses roared to life. In Kyiv, residents woke to the sound of their walls shaking as debris rained down from intercepted missiles. In Odessa, the glow of fire illuminated the waterfront as emergency teams scrambled to control the spread of flames. Across the capital, Kyiv, people huddled in underground shelters, their phones glowing dimly as they scrolled through updates, searching for answers and hoping that the next explosion wouldn't fall closer than the last. He emphasized how these attacks weren't random. They came during a delicate moment when diplomats, analysts, and media outlets across the world were closely watching Trump's attempts to step back into the global spotlight with promises to negotiate peace between Russia and Ukraine. But those efforts, like many before them, had stalled. Ukrainian officials remained skeptical, Western leaders were divided, and Russia, sensing the political gridlock, seemed emboldened. The timing of the attacks felt intentional, almost like Moscow's way of sending a message. Talks may stall, promises may fade, but the war will continue on Russia's terms. And so, the strikes came in waves. He describes how air raid sirens wailed through the streets, a haunting, familiar sound that cut through the cold air and echoed against empty buildings. Families rushed into subway tunnels, clutching blankets, pets, and whatever belongings they could carry. Children pressed their hands to their ears while elderly men and women tried to steady their breathing, reminding themselves that they had survived many nights before. For some, it was the fifth shelter night this week. For others, it was their first time hearing the distant explosion of a drone being intercepted. Meanwhile, Ukrainian soldiers posted along the front lines didn't flinch. They had grown used to Russia's tactic: escalate when diplomacy falters, push harder when the world is distracted. He illustrates how the soldiers monitored drone radar feeds glowing green and ghostly in the darkness. Each signal spike meant another drone approaching, each streak on the screen another target racing toward them with deadly intent. And while Ukraine's air defense successfully intercepted many of the incoming threats, even just one that slipped through was enough to devastate a neighborhood, a school, a hospital, or a power station. He shifts the narrative toward the political atmosphere in Washington and Europe. Trump continued pushing the idea that he could end the war within 24 hours, but experts, diplomats, and even Ukrainian officials quietly dismissed the claim, saying the situation was far more complicated than a single phone call or handshake. Russia, for its part, showed no interest in slowing down. Kremlin officials ignored calls for negotiation. Putin emphasized that Russia would continue operations until its objectives were met, objectives that had shifted several times, but always pointed toward expanding influence, territory, and military presence. As the strikes continued, he paints the emotional landscape of Ukraine. People exhausted, anxious, yet remarkably resilient. Firefighters raced down smoke-filled streets, navigating around shattered glass and burning debris. Medics pulled injured civilians from collapsed buildings, wrapping them in blankets as ambulances carried them away. Volunteers passed out warm tea and bread to families emerging from shelters at dawn. Even in destruction, there was unity. Even in fear, there was strength. By the time the sun rose, the extent of the damage across Ukraine was still being assessed. Government officials released statements condemning the attacks and warning that more could come. Analysts speculated that Russia would escalate further, either to pressure the West, undermine Ukrainian morale, or send a political signal at a moment when the world was watching the stalled efforts of global leaders. And he, narrating it all for United War, made it clear that this was only the beginning. The strikes tonight were not just explosions. They were indicators of a broader shift in the conflict, a sign that Russia was prepared to intensify the war even as negotiations faltered and diplomatic paths narrowed. With Trump's efforts stalled and global uncertainty rising, Ukraine braced for what could become another long and difficult chapter in a war entering a new, volatile phase.
He continued the story on United War with the weight of the previous night still fresh in his voice, drawing viewers deeper into the unfolding crisis. The sun had barely risen over Ukraine when the reality of the destruction began to surface. Across several regions, smoke drifted into the pale morning sky, rising from craters and shattered structures. Emergency crews were already working non-stop, their reflective vests glowing faintly as they moved through neighborhoods struck only hours before. He described how the quiet moments after an attack often felt the most haunting, when the explosions had stopped, but the fear remained, lingering in the air like the dust that settled on every broken street. Residents slowly emerged from shelters, their steps cautious, their expressions blank as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. Some had spent the night in basements or subway stations, listening to sirens and distant impacts, wondering if their homes still stood. Others returned to find their windows blown out, their doors twisted from pressure, and their hallways filled with debris. The feeling wasn't panic, it was exhaustion, the kind that comes from living through too many nights like this one. As he narrated, he shifted to the frontline reports. Ukrainian military units stationed in the east and south confirmed that Russian forces had intensified artillery shelling and drone attacks. Soldiers described how they could hear the constant hum of Iranian-made drones overhead, weaving through the clouds like predators searching through openings in Ukrainian defenses. Interception crews had worked endlessly through the night, tracking targets on screens, calling out coordinates, launching countermeasures with precision and urgency. One soldier, speaking anonymously, said that the strikes felt more coordinated this time, more synchronized with movements along the front. To him, it was a clear sign that Russia was testing Ukraine's limits, probing its defenses, watching its reactions. It wasn't random. It was strategic pressure applied at a moment when the global political climate was shifting awkwardly. He explained how several analysts believed the timing was not accidental. The world had been watching Trump's promise to mediate peace talks, yet nothing materialized. Negotiations remained frozen. Western countries debated aid packages. Political energy moved slower than military force, and Russia seized the opportunity. In Moscow, statements coming from the Kremlin framed the strikes as necessary, accusing Ukraine of provocation, an excuse the world had heard too many times. Putin remained firm, repeating that Russia would not halt operations until its objectives were met. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials, weary but resolute, insisted that any negotiations must begin with the restoration of Ukraine's borders. They rejected the idea of concessions. They rejected the idea of freezing the conflict. And they rejected the notion that outside political figures could dictate terms that Ukrainians themselves would not accept. As daylight spread, the human stories came into clearer focus. He described a family in Kyiv returning to their apartment only to find their kitchen ceiling collapsed, their walls cracked, their belongings buried under rubble. The mother, holding her small son in her arms, stood silently at the doorway, unsure where to begin. In another district, an elderly man swept glass from his stairwell, while neighbors helped each other carry damaged furniture outside. Firefighters, exhausted from the night's battles against fires and collapsing structures, continued checking buildings for survivors, ready to respond to any secondary explosions or gas leaks. Even with the chaos, there were moments of unity. Volunteers setting up tables with hot food, neighbors sharing supplies, rescue workers comforting frightened children. It was this resilience he highlighted, how Ukrainians found strength not in calm days, but in the darkest nights. He expanded the narrative to show how the world responded. In Washington, officials expressed deep concern, while European leaders condemned Russia's actions, calling on Moscow to cease strikes immediately. But behind the scenes, he explained, there was growing frustration. Aid debates dragged on in multiple governments. Financial packages moved slowly. Political disagreements divided lawmakers. And all the while, Ukraine faced immediate physical threats every day. The disconnect between political timelines and battlefield realities had never felt so wide. Trump's stalled attempts to restart peace discussions only reflected a broader truth. There was no clear global strategy for ending this war. The world watched, commented, criticized, supported, but decisive action remained scattered. Meanwhile, Russian state media portrayed the attacks as signs of progress, claiming that military objectives were being met. Yet on the ground, the reality told a different story. Ukrainian defenses continued to intercept a majority of incoming missiles. Frontline positions remained stable. And while Russia had inflicted damage, it had not broken Ukraine's resolve or defensive structure. The strikes, as intense as they were, symbolized pressure, not victory. And as he narrated this, he reminded viewers that Ukraine had endured far worse earlier in the war and had always emerged with determination intact. By midday, Ukraine's emergency services released updated figures: multiple regions hit, homes damaged, energy facilities affected, and civilians injured. The exact number of casualties was still being verified. Investigators photographed impact zones, marking debris and examining missile fragments. Local officials coordinated repairs to power lines and water systems, working quickly in case more strikes came later in the day. And they often did. Ukraine had learned that Russian attacks rarely came in single waves. Night, morning, afternoon, it didn't matter. The risk was constant. And he closed part 2 by focusing on the emotional landscape. Even as fear lingered, there was also a quiet bravery in the way people continued with their lives. Parents still walked their children to school. Workers still headed to their jobs. Troops still held their positions. And every Ukrainian understood that surviving one attack didn't end the danger. It simply prepared them for the next. But still, they carried on, because stopping was never an option. And as Russia increased its strikes while global diplomacy stumbled, Ukraine braced for an uncertain path forward, one shaped not by promises of peace, but by the realities of war.
As the day continued, he guided the audience of United War deeper into the heart of the unfolding events, showing how the tension across Ukraine didn't fade with sunlight, it intensified. By afternoon, new warnings emerged from Ukrainian intelligence, suggesting Russia was preparing another coordinated strike. Satellite imagery revealed unusual movements at Russian launch sites, and intercepted communications hinted at a potential second wave targeting infrastructure across central and eastern regions. He described how Ukrainian officials immediately urged residents to stay near shelters and keep phones fully charged, knowing from experience that Russia often waited for evening hours, when visibility dropped and streets emptied, before unleashing fresh attacks. The hours leading up to dusk felt like an uneasy calm, a calm everyone understood could end abruptly. In Kyiv, life resumed in a way only a war-tested city could manage. People lined up at bakeries, markets reopened, and trams rattled along damaged tracks, carrying workers who refused to abandon their routines. He narrated how this stubborn normalcy was a form of resistance. Every coffee brewed, every office reopened, every lesson taught in a half-lit classroom was a reminder that the people of Ukraine were determined to hold on to the fragments of daily life that war constantly tried to steal. Yet beneath this quiet determination, everyone's eyes flickered toward the sky at the sound of every distant rumble. Was it thunder? Construction? Another interception? In a city under threat, even silence felt suspicious. Meanwhile, in Washington, the political conversation around Trump's stalled peace efforts continued to ripple.
He explained how analysts debated whether Trump's involvement was ever realistic or merely a symbolic gesture aimed at gaining political leverage. Ukrainian officials remained cautious, often stating that any negotiation must come from within established diplomatic channels, not through a single individual, former president or not. European leaders echoed this sentiment, reinforcing that peace required structural agreements, not vague promises. Still, the mere mention of peace talks, even failed ones, had ripple effects. Russia tested boundaries, Ukraine prepared defenses, and global media sought to interpret every movement as a sign of what's to come. He shifted his focus to the front lines, where the situation grew increasingly tense. In the Donetsk region, Ukrainian units reported a series of small probing attacks, Russian infantry attempting to identify weaknesses along the trenches. Drones buzzed overhead, scanning for artillery positions. Ukrainian soldiers, warned but alert, held their ground, relying on experience and instinct to anticipate enemy movements. He narrated how these men and women, many of them exhausted from months of relentless fighting, understood that Russia often used frontline pressure to accompany missile strikes elsewhere, overwhelming Ukraine's defenses both physically and psychologically. Yet the Ukrainian troops did not retreat. They dug deeper trenches, reinforced positions, and readied themselves for whatever the night might bring. As evening approached, reports flooded in of Russian bombers taking off from air bases, suggesting that another wave of long-range missiles was imminent. Ukraine's air defense teams sprang into action, monitoring radar, checking launchers, and preparing interceptors. In command rooms lit with dull green screen glows, officers tracked every blip on radar grids. He described the atmosphere: calm but tense, professional but anxious. Everyone knew the stakes. Every successful interception could save dozens of lives. Every failure could mean another destroyed home, another fire, another family left in mourning. In cities across Ukraine, families returned to shelters, carrying bags with essential items, flashlights, water, snacks, documents, chargers. Many had spent the previous night underground, and now they prepared for another. He narrated how children, despite the fear, played simple games in shelter corridors, their laughter echoing through thick walls while adults tried to mask their worry. Volunteers circulated with warm drinks and blankets, offering comfort where they could. Some residents prayed silently. Others scrolled through news updates, searching for signs of when the next attack might begin. Then, just after nightfall, the first sirens began. Long, piercing wails filled the air, cutting through the darkness and sending waves of adrenaline across cities. He described how lights and apartment windows quickly disappeared as people moved to safe areas. Traffic vanished. Streets fell quiet. Only the distant growl of generators and the soft thud of hurried footsteps remained. Moments later, Ukraine's air defense systems roared to life. Bright trails shot upward into the black sky, illuminating the clouds in flashes of white light. The thunder of explosions followed, some from successful interceptions, others from impacts on the ground. In Khmelnytsky, a missile struck a warehouse district, sending flames and smoke into the sky. Fire crews raced to the scene, their sirens echoing across dark streets. In Poltava, a drone crashed into an industrial zone, igniting a fire that glowed orange behind rows of factories. In Kyiv, the sky flickered as air defenses intercepted multiple missiles over the city, scattering burning fragments across empty roads and rooftops. He narrated these scenes not as isolated incidents, but as pieces of a larger pattern, Russia's determination to intensify pressure while diplomatic talks stalled in distant capitals. He highlighted the emotional strain this placed on Ukrainian families. For many, sleep had become a luxury, constantly interrupted by sirens and distant booms. Parents reassured frightened children, even as they fought back their own fear. Elderly residents, some unable to move quickly, relied on neighbors and volunteers. Every night brought uncertainty, and every morning brought exhaustion. But still, no one spoke of giving up. As the second wave of strikes continued, he pointed out how Ukraine's resilience shone. Firefighters worked through the night, often without pause. Medics treated injuries quickly and calmly. Volunteers distributed food and comfort to those displaced. And Ukrainian soldiers, even after long battles at the front, sent messages to their families to reassure them that they were safe, even when they weren't entirely sure themselves. By midnight, the intensity of the strikes began to fade, but the tension lingered. Damage reports slowly filtered in, painting a grim but familiar picture. Buildings destroyed, infrastructure hit, civilians injured, fires still burning. He concluded Part 3 by reflecting on the broader implications. Russia's renewed assaults were not merely military actions, they were signals that Moscow intended to escalate, signals that diplomacy remained stuck, signals that Ukraine would face many more difficult nights ahead. But above all, he emphasized the one message that Russia's attacks had repeatedly failed to erase. Ukraine's resolve remained unbroken. No matter how many missiles Russia launched, no matter how many political talks stalled abroad, the spirit of the Ukrainian people continued to stand firm, preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring.
The hours rolled into a quieter, uneasy night across Ukraine. But quiet was never truly calm anymore. The sky carried a tense stillness that felt heavier than the explosions that had echoed earlier. As the world watched, it became painfully clear that the conflict was entering yet another uncertain chapter, one marked not only by military pressure, but by diplomatic deadlock. And for the millions caught in the middle, hope remained suspended somewhere between silence and shattered promises. From Washington to Brussels to Kyiv, the conversations around peace had become increasingly fragmented. Donald Trump's efforts to push forward negotiations, efforts that once stirred waves of discussion, now seemed to hang in place, unmoving. Analysts everywhere wondered what had caused the stall. Was it political resistance, strategic hesitation, or simply the reality that neither side felt ready to yield ground? Observers could only speculate, but the effect was unmistakable. Without progress on the diplomatic front, the attacks continued. Inside Kyiv, families gathered around small radios and dim phone screens, listening to updates trickling in through news outlets and official briefings. They heard about the strikes on infrastructure, the damage done to power lines and communication towers, and the impact on cities already stretched thin. Every announcement reminded them that the war was far from over, and every pause in the broadcasts made them hope that maybe, just maybe, the next update would carry news of negotiation breakthroughs. But none came. As rescue crews continued moving from one damaged structure to the next, reports of injuries and displacement added weight to an already heavy day. Ukraine's emergency services, exhausted and working around the clock, knew that every hour could bring a new wave of casualties. Still, they pushed forward. Despite the cold, despite the fatigue, despite the uncertainty of what awaited them around each corner, they kept searching, rescuing, and rebuilding. Even far from the front line, the psychological effects of the war wore people down. Parents tried to comfort children who had grown up thinking that sirens were normal. Elderly residents who had lived through previous periods of conflict wondered how many more times they would have to endure this. And young adults, many of whom had already lost friends to the fighting, questioned what kind of future remained beyond the smoke. Across the Atlantic, political figures debated loudly while diplomats quietly coordinated behind closed doors. Trump's team insisted they were committed to finding a path toward negotiations. Critics argued that the strategy lacked clarity, while supporters believed it was being obstructed by external pressure. Whatever the truth, the lack of movement meant Ukraine continued to face the full force of Russian strikes with no sign of relief. Meanwhile, the Russian offensive remained steady. Targeted infrastructure, military zones, and strategic positions across Ukrainian territory signaled that Moscow had no intention of slowing its operations. Every missile launch, every drone strike, every artillery round reinforced the message that this war would not pause simply because diplomatic talks had. The battlefield moved independently of boardrooms and press conferences. International organizations issued statements urging restraint, calling for renewed peace efforts, and condemning attacks that endangered civilians. But to those on the ground, the statements often felt like echoes, loud, important, but too distant to change the reality immediately surrounding them. In cities facing blackouts, people lit candles and wrapped blankets around themselves, waiting for generators to restart or power lines to be repaired. They carried on because they had no other choice. As midnight approached, the world's attention began shifting from breaking news alerts to nighttime commentary. Analysts reviewed satellite imagery of the impact zones, offering detailed breakdowns of the strikes. They highlighted the scale of destruction, the tactical patterns behind the attacks, and the growing urgency for diplomatic intervention. Yet even with all the analysis, one conclusion stood above the rest. Without real progress in peace talks, the cycle of violence would continue. At the same time, rumors about behind-the-scenes conversations floated through social media platforms. Some claimed that negotiations could restart within weeks. Others insisted that neither side was ready for real compromise. But none of the whispers matched the reality unfolding on the ground. What mattered most now were the decisions of leaders who held the power to influence the course of the war, and whether they would act before the situation escalated further. The people of Ukraine went to sleep knowing that tomorrow could bring more strikes, more uncertainty, or perhaps another glimmer of hope. The war had become a series of days filled with unpredictable turns, moments of destruction followed by moments of resilience, despair followed by determination. Even as the strikes continued, so did the will of the Ukrainian people to survive, rebuild, and hold on until peace finally arrived. For now, the world waited. Ukraine waited. Diplomats waited. And somewhere between stalled negotiations and rising tensions, the future of the conflict remained uncertain. But what was clear, even through the smoke of the day's explosions, was that the war was entering a phase where every decision, every mistake, and every delay carried enormous consequences. And as United War continued to bring these unfolding events to viewers, the message was simple. This conflict is not just about maps and politics. It is about the millions of lives affected every single day, caught between the decisions of leaders and the realities of war. Their stories, their struggles, and their hopes deserve to be seen, heard, and remembered, especially in moments when peace felt just out of reach.